November 1906. Jesse Livermore is sitting on the wrong side of a cotton trade. Not a small position, a significant one. Large enough that the losses accumulating against him are real, the kind of real that wakes you up at 3 a.m. and sits on your chest until morning. He had entered the trade on what he believed was a sound rid of supply and demand conditions in the cotton market. The analysis was careful. The timing, he thought, was right. The market disagreed. Day after day, the position moved against him, and something strange began to happen, something Livermore would spend the next 3 decades trying to understand and articulate. Not in the account, in his head. He started making decisions he couldn't fully explain afterward. He added to the position when every principle he had developed said not to. He reinterpreted price action that was clearly bearish as temporarily misleading. He found himself checking the tape more frequently, not to gather information, but to find reassurance. To find the one data point that would confirm the story he needed to be true. He wasn't trading anymore. He was reacting. And the reactions were getting worse, not better, the longer the losing streak continued. Years later, writing about that period, he said something that I've never seen in any other trading book. He said the most important thing he learned from that cotton trade had nothing to do with cotton, nothing to do with supply and demand, nothing to do with entry timing or position sizing or any of the technical elements he'd spent years developing. What he learned was this: losing money changes your brain. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Functionally, mechanically, in ways that are specific and predictable and that operate completely below the level of conscious awareness. And until you understand exactly what those changes are, until you can name them, recognize them in real time, and build something in your trading that accounts for them, you are not trading the market. You are trading your own neurology against itself. That's what this episode is about. Let's start somewhere that might surprise you. Not with trading. With a study done at the California Institute of Technology in the early 2000s, decades after Livermore's time, but vindicating something he understood intuitively long before the neuroscience existed to explain it. Researchers were looking at how the human brain processes financial loss, not theoretical loss, actual loss, money leaving an account in real time. And what they found when they looked at the brain scans was striking. The regions that activated during financial loss were not the regions associated with rational decision-making. They were not the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, consequence evaluation, and rule following. They were the regions associated with physical pain and social threat, the same neural architecture that activates when you burn your hand on a stove, the same systems that fire when you're being excluded from a group, the same deep, old, evolutionarily ancient machinery that the human brain built over millions of years to deal with threats to survival. Financial loss, to your brain, is not an intellectual event. It is a survival threat. And your brain responds to it accordingly. By doing exactly what it was designed to do when survival is threatened. It narrows, it speeds up, it prioritizes immediate threat elimination over long-term consequence evaluation. It makes you reactive rather than deliberate, impulsive rather than methodical, desperate rather than patient. And it does all of this without asking your permission, without announcing what it's doing, without giving you any indication from the inside that the quality of your thinking has changed. From the inside, you still feel like yourself. You still feel like you're thinking. The thoughts still feel like analysis. The decisions still feel considered. But you are operating in a fundamentally altered state, and the decisions coming out of that state are not the decisions of the calm, systematic, analytically grounded trader who built your methodology in the first place. They are the decisions of a brain under threat, trying to survive. Jesse Livermore figured this out in 1906 without a brain scanner. He figured it out the expensive way, by watching himself make decisions he couldn't rationally justify in the middle of a losing streak and being honest enough to ask why. The cotton trade eventually resolved. Livermore took his losses, stepped back, and did something that was unusual for a man of his era and his temperament. He conducted what we might now call a post-mortem, a systematic, honest examination of every decision he'd made during the losing period, not to assign blame, not to find the market data he'd missed, to understand what had happened inside his own decision-making process as the losses accumulated. What he found was a pattern, and it wasn't random, it was sequential. It happened in a specific order, with a specific progression, and it happened the same way every time, not just in cotton, but in every extended losing period he could recall. He identified 3 distinct stages. The first stage he described as the stage of increased certainty. This sounds counterintuitive. You're losing, so why would certainty increase? But that's exactly what happened. As the position moved against him, rather than becoming more open to the possibility that the thesis was wrong, his conviction in the thesis actually strengthened. He held onto his original read more tightly. He interpreted the adverse price action as temporary, as the market being wrong, as noise that would resolve in his favor. The losing position made him more certain, not less. He would later understand why. The brain, threatened by loss, does not respond by becoming more open to new information. It responds by defending existing beliefs more aggressively. Because changing your belief, admitting you might be wrong, means accepting that the loss might be real and permanent. And accepting a permanent loss is a threat the brain is desperately trying to avoid. So it doubles down on the original thesis, not as a rational strategy, as a defense mechanism. The second stage he described as the stage of compulsive action. This was where the decisions he couldn't explain afterwards started appearing. Checking the tape every 15 minutes when nothing new could have developed in 15 minutes. Adding to the position that specific violation of his own rules, driven by a logic that felt sound in the moment, but that he couldn't reconstruct clearly afterward. Moving stop levels, adjusting position sizes, doing things, constant, restless, agitated doing of things. The brain under threat needs to act. Inaction, when survival machinery is engaged, is itself a threat. The paralysis of sitting with an open losing position and doing nothing is neurologically intolerable. So the brain generates action, any action, to create the feeling of agency, of control, of doing something about the situation. Most of that action makes things worse, not because the specific actions are obviously wrong, because they are being generated by a system optimized for speed and survival rather than for accuracy and long-term consequence. The third stage, and this was the one Livermore found most troubling, the one he came back to in his writing more than the others, he described as the stage of narrowed vision. By this point in an extended losing streak, the field of awareness had contracted dramatically. He was no longer watching the broader market, no longer tracking the macro conditions that had informed the original thesis, no longer comparing the current situation to historical patterns with genuine objectivity. His entire attentional field had collapsed inward, to the position, to the P&L, to the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. The market was still out there, still communicating, still offering information that a trader in a calm state would have found genuinely useful, but he couldn't see it. The narrowed vision of a brain in threat response mode had reduced the available world to a single point of focus, the losing trade and the need to make it stop. Now I want you to feel this, not understand it, feel it, because odds are you've been in all 3 of those stages, maybe not in a single trade, maybe across a bad week or a brutal month, maybe in a specific period of your trading life that you remember with a kind of visceral discomfort that's different from the ordinary discomfort of being wrong about a trade. That specific flavor of discomfort, that particular combination of anxiety and compulsion, and tunnel vision, and the sense that your judgment has somehow gotten away from you. That's what Livermore was describing. The increased certainty that makes you hold too long, the compulsive action that makes you do things you can't justify in retrospect, the narrowed vision that makes you miss what the market is plainly showing you because your whole awareness has collapsed around a single point of pain. You've been there. The question isn't whether this happens to you. The question is what you've been calling it when it does. Most traders call it a bad run, bad luck, a difficult market environment, a period where nothing was working. The external explanations are always available, always partially true, and always more comfortable than the internal one. The internal one is this: your brain was compromised, functioning in a threat response mode that was not designed for financial markets and that produces predictably poor decisions when applied to them. Not because you're weak, not because you're not smart enough, because you're human. Because the machinery that generates these responses is older and faster and more powerful than the prefrontal cortex that you call your judgment. And until you build something in your trading that accounts for this machinery, that works with it rather than pretending it doesn't exist, you will keep ending up in those 3 stages every time an extended losing period arrives. Here is where Livermore's thinking gets genuinely sophisticated, and where I think he was years, maybe decades, ahead of what most trading education even today is willing to acknowledge. He didn't try to eliminate the neurological response to loss. He didn't pretend that discipline could override the survival machinery. He was too honest and had been too expensive in his education to believe that willpower was a reliable defense against something operating at that level of the nervous system. Instead, he built around it. He designed a trading methodology that assumed the neurological compromise would happen. That treated his own degraded judgment during losing periods not as a failure to be overcome, but as a condition to be managed, a weather system to be navigated, not fought. The first thing he built was what he called his money rules. These were not guidelines, not principles, not suggestions he made to himself in calm moments that he hoped to remember during difficult ones. They were hard limits, mechanical constraints on what he was permitted to do with his capital at different stages of his trading. Maximum position sizes, maximum total exposure. Mandatory pause periods after losses of a specific magnitude. The pause periods are the part I want to focus on because they're the most radical element of what he built, and the one most directly responsive to the neurological reality of losing streaks. After losing a specific amount, a threshold he set in advance in a calm state, before any of the 3 stages had been activated, Livermore would stop. Not reduce size, not trade more carefully, stop entirely, remove himself from the market, take days, sometimes weeks, away from active trading. Not because the market had become less readable, not because his analytical capabilities had diminished in some permanent way, because he understood that the brain operating in stage 3 of a losing streak, the stage of narrowed vision, of collapsed attentional field, of survival mode decision-making, was not capable of the quality of judgment his methodology required, and no amount of effort, no amount of discipline, no amount of conscious determination to trade better was going to change that. Because the problem wasn't at the level of conscious effort, it was at the level of neurological state. And neurological states don't respond to willpower, they respond to time, to rest, to the removal of the stressor, in this case the open losing positions and the daily confrontation with the account that was down. He called this stepping back to see clearly again, and he was explicit about why it worked, not because the market changed while he was away, but because he changed. The threat response machinery, deprived of the stressor that activated it, gradually de-escalated. The narrowed vision began to widen. The compulsive action impulse quieted. The stage 1 defensive certainty softened into genuine openness to new information. He came back to the market as a different version of himself than the one who had left. Not smarter, not more skilled, just less compromised, more available to the level of clear, patient, methodical observation that his best trading required. There's a specific behavior that Livermore identified as the most reliable indicator that stage 2, the compulsive action stage, had fully taken over. And it's one of those observations that once you hear it, you will recognize in your own trading history with an uncomfortable immediacy. He called it trading to trade. Not trading because a genuine setup had appeared. Not trading because the tape was communicating something specific and actionable. Trading because the need to do something, the neurological imperative generated by the threat response machinery, had become stronger than the discipline to wait for a real opportunity. Trading to trade looks like a lot of things. It looks like entering a position in a market you've never traded before, because your usual market isn't giving you anything. It looks like taking a trade with a setup that's close enough to your criteria when in a calm state you would have passed. It looks like increasing position size after a loss, the opposite of what sound risk management dictates, because the larger position feels like it might recover the loss faster. All of these actions share a common feature. They are generated by the internal state of the trader, not by the external reality of the market. The market is not offering these opportunities. The trader's compromised neurology is manufacturing the need for them and then finding them, in charts that don't quite qualify, in setups that don't fully meet the criteria, in markets that aren't genuinely understood. Livermore watched himself do this during the cotton period. He watched himself enter trades in markets he had no business being in on the basis of analysis that he knew, even at the time, was thinner than what he would normally require. He watched the compulsive action take over, the need to do something generating a steady stream of activity that looked like trading, but was actually the survival machinery running on overdrive. And he watched each of those compulsive trades make the situation worse, not just financially, though they did that too, psychologically. Each additional loss added more fuel to the threat response, deepened the stage 2 state, generated more compulsive action, created a feedback loop that was genuinely difficult to interrupt from the inside. The only interruption that worked was the one he eventually built into his rules, the mandatory stop. The pre-committed pause that engaged not when he felt like stopping. He almost never felt like stopping in stage 2, because stage 2 was characterized by the compulsion to act, but when a specific, predefined threshold was crossed. The threshold was the circuit breaker, the thing that interrupted the feedback loop before it could complete its full destructive cycle. I want to spend some time on something that doesn't get discussed enough in this context, because everything I've described so far focuses on what losing does to decision-making quality, and that's real and important. But Livermore identified something else, something that operates alongside the decision-making degradation and compounds it in ways that take longer to recognize and longer to recover from. He called it the loss of feel. This is subtle, and it requires a specific kind of self-awareness to even notice it's happening, let alone to understand what it means. Every experienced trader develops over time a feel for the markets they trade, not a mystical intuition, a calibrated sensitivity built from thousands of hours of observation to the specific textures and rhythms and behavioral tendencies of a particular market. The way a stock moves before it breaks out, the way volume patterns shift during distribution, the difference between a pullback that's setting up for continuation and one that's signaling reversal. This feel is real. It's not superstition, it's pattern recognition, the accumulated product of sustained, attentive observation over a long period. And it's one of the most valuable things an experienced trader has. It's the thing that makes the setup feel right or wrong, at a level that sometimes precedes the conscious identification of exactly why. Losing streaks erode it, not permanently, but significantly, and in ways that aren't immediately obvious, because the feel isn't just a product of observational experience, it's a product of observational experience in a specific neurological state, the state of calm, open, attentive engagement with the market that produces genuine pattern recognition. During a losing streak, that state is unavailable. The threat response machinery has occupied the neurological territory that calm engagement normally occupies. The attention is narrowed. The receptivity is compromised. The trader is no longer observing the market. They are monitoring it, watching for the specific data points that serve the survival narrative rather than openly receiving whatever the market is actually communicating. In this state, the feel doesn't just become less reliable, it becomes deceptive. The pattern recognition system, running on compromised input data filtered through threat response priorities, starts generating signals that feel like feel, but aren't. Signals that confirm the existing narrative. Signals that serve the need to act. Signals that look from the inside like the familiar intuitive guidance of experience, but that are actually the output of a system running on corrupted data. Livermore described this as one of the most dangerous phases of a losing streak, the phase where you think you've recovered your feel, but haven't, where the confidence that comes from stage 1's increased certainty combines with the compulsive action of stage 2 and produces a trader who is simultaneously overconfident and operating on corrupted pattern recognition. The result is decisive action, taken quickly, based on what feels like genuine insight. And it's wrong, consistently expensively wrong, because the feel isn't real feel, it's the shadow of feel, cast by a neurological state that mimics genuine engagement while being fundamentally compromised. The mandatory pause, the circuit breaker, serves a second function here beyond interrupting the compulsive action loop. It gives the feel time to recalibrate, to reset to genuine open receptivity, to become trustworthy again. Time is the only thing that does this. Not discipline, not effort, not trying harder to observe clearly. Time away from the stressor. Time for the nervous system to de-escalate. Time for the real feel to return. There's a question that naturally arises at this point, and I want to address it directly because it's the right question and it doesn't have an easy answer. If the neurological compromise is this significant, if the 3 stages Livermore described represent a genuine functional degradation in trading decision quality, why do some traders seem to handle losing streaks without falling apart? Why do some people appear to maintain their discipline, their patience, their methodological consistency, even during extended adverse periods? Livermore had an answer, and it's more nuanced than simply, those traders have better discipline. He observed that the severity and speed of onset of the 3 stages varied considerably between traders, and the variation wasn't primarily determined by intelligence or experience, or even by the quality of their trading methodology. It was determined by something that most trading education doesn't address at all. It was determined by the size of the position relative to the trader's genuine emotional tolerance for loss. Not the loss tolerance they believed they had. Not the loss tolerance they had tested in calm periods, in theoretical scenarios, in backtests and hypotheticals. The actual, real, visceral tolerance for watching specific dollar amounts leave their account in real time. Livermore was explicit about this. Every trader has a number, a specific loss level, not a percentage, not a ratio, but an actual dollar amount that activates the threat response machinery at full intensity. Below that number, losses are uncomfortable but manageable. The 3 stages may begin, but they progress slowly and remain interruptible. Above that number, the machinery engages at a level that overrides conscious control. The stages progress quickly. The decision quality degrades rapidly, the feedback loop accelerates, and the critical insight, the one that changed how Livermore thought about position sizing more than anything else, is that this number is both real and highly individual, and it is almost always lower than the trader believes it to be. We consistently overestimate our tolerance for loss, not because we're dishonest with ourselves, because the only way to know your real number is to experience it. And most traders discover their real number in the worst possible way, by being in a position that crosses it and watching their decision quality collapse in real time, often in a trade that's already large enough to do serious damage. Livermore's practical response to this was to size positions conservatively enough that even the worst anticipated loss sequence would stay below the threshold. Not below the threshold of what the account could technically survive, below the threshold of what the nervous system could survive without triggering full threat response engagement. He called this trading within yourself, and he meant it literally. Within the specific, individual, genuine boundaries of your real emotional tolerance, not the tolerance you theorize you have, but the tolerance your nervous system actually demonstrates when the losses are real and mounting. This is why the same position size can be perfectly appropriate for one trader and catastrophically large for another, even if the accounts are identical, even if the experience levels are similar, even if the analytical capabilities are matched. Because the number is individual, the threshold is personal, and the consequences of crossing it are not a matter of discipline or character. They are a matter of neuroscience. Let me bring Livermore back into the center of this, because everything I've described, the 3 stages, the mandatory pause, the loss of feel, the individual threshold, he didn't learn from a book or a study or a theory. He learned it from the cotton trade. From sitting in a losing position long enough to watch himself move through every stage he would later describe. From making decisions he couldn't justify and then being honest enough to examine why he'd made them. From discovering, in the most uncomfortable way available, that the version of himself operating in stage 3 of a losing streak was not the version he trusted to make trading decisions. And from deciding, quietly without drama, as a practical response to a practical problem, that if that version of himself was going to show up eventually, as it clearly would, the answer was not to try to prevent its arrival. The answer was to build a system that limited the damage it could do when it got there. The mandatory pause, the position limits, the pre-committed thresholds, the circuit breakers. Not because he was weak, because he was honest about what happened to all traders, including the most capable ones, when the losses accumulated past a certain point. And because the honest response to that reality was not heroic discipline, it was structural accommodation. Build the system to survive the worst version of yourself, not because the worst version is coming every day, but because it's coming eventually. And when it arrives, the account should still be intact enough to trade when the best version returns. That's the framework. That's the thing that outlasted every market cycle, every losing streak, every period where the 3 stages took over and the decision quality collapsed. The structure survived what the discipline couldn't always hold. There's one more thing Livermore observed about losing streaks that I want to leave you with, because it's the part that took him longest to understand. And it's the part that, once understood, changes the relationship with losing in a way that is genuinely different from anything discipline or rules can produce. He came to believe that losing streaks were not random, not in the sense that they were predictable, and they weren't, but in the sense that they were informative, that every extended losing period contained specific, retrievable information about some element of the trading methodology, or the market conditions, or the trader's own psychology that was not yet fully understood. The losses were not just painful, they were diagnostic. Every losing streak was the market's way of pointing at something, at a setup that was working in one environment and had stopped working in another, at a position sizing habit that was fine in low volatility conditions and catastrophic in high volatility ones, at a psychological pattern like the 3 stages that had been operating below awareness and was now visible because the losses had made it impossible to ignore. He stopped experiencing losing streaks purely as things to survive and started experiencing them, after the mandatory pause, after the nervous system had de-escalated, after the real feel had returned, as information, as data about the gaps between what he thought he understood and what the market was actually showing him. This shift didn't make losing streaks painless. They were still painful. The 3 stages still arrived, the neurological compromise still happened. But on the other side of the pause, in the quieter, clearer state that the circuit breaker created, he had learned to ask a different question than the one most traders ask after a losing period. Most traders ask, how do I make this back? Livermore learned to ask, what is this trying to show me? Those 2 questions lead to very different places. The first leads back into the market too soon, with compromised judgment and the desperate energy of a trader trying to recover rather than understand. The second leads to the kind of honest, rigorous examination of the losing period that produces genuine knowledge. The kind that makes the next inevitable losing streak a little shorter, a little less deep, a little less damaging, because the gap it was pointing at has been partially closed. He never claimed to have eliminated losing streaks. He never claimed to have mastered the 3 stages so completely that they no longer arrived. What he claimed, through his results, through his writing, through the framework he built and rebuilt across 40 years, was that he had learned to make losing streaks useful, not comfortable, not painless, not something to look forward to. Useful. And in markets, where losing is not an aberration but an inevitable feature of the landscape, where every trader, at every level of experience, will spend meaningful portions of their career in the stages Livermore described. That might be the most honest and most powerful thing anyone has ever said about what losing is actually for. The link to Livermore's books is in the description. How to Trade in Stocks, Reminiscences of a Stock Operator. Read them not looking for rules. Read them looking for the moments when he's describing his own psychology, his own losing periods, his own stage 2 decisions he couldn't justify, his own process of coming back to clarity after the threat response had run its course. Those moments are in there. They're not always labeled as such, but they're there, and when you find them, you'll recognize them because you've been there too.